Hello and welcome to Lecture 4, Technology as an Instrument of Social Control. In this lecture, I introduce Herbert Marcuse, the author of the readings for this module, and discuss some key elements of this critical theory of technology that he develops in the introduction and the first chapter of his book, The One-Dimensional Man. So first, a few preliminary notes about Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was one of the central figures of the Institute for Social Research, or the so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. This Institute for Social Research, or Frankfurt School, was a really important interdisciplinary research group that began in Germany in the 1930s as a way of trying to understand the origins of National Socialism in Germany. So this kind of Frankfurt School, so to speak, again, this kind of interdisciplinary research group where you've got philosophers, scientists, economists, political scientists, even film critics, getting together and trying to kind of pool their resources and try to understand, well, how did Germany all of a sudden fall prey to National Socialism and Nazism? So Marcuse, he begins really his career being involved with this so-called Frankfurt School and trying to raise these sorts of questions. So then Marcuse, he ended up emigrating to the United States during the Third Reich as an intellectual and academic with Jewish ancestry. So he had to flee Nazi Germany, and he ended up coming to the United States, where he taught at Brandeis University in New York. And there he taught several students, several important, famous, future famous students such as Angela Davis and others. And eventually he ended up moving to California and teaching at University of San Diego. So Marcuse more or less kind of spent the latter part of his career, as an academic and as a professor teaching at University of California at San Diego. However, something that's kind of interesting that's recently come out about Marcuse is that, well, he actually wrote anti-Nazi propaganda for the CIA in addition to his academic professorial career. Again, Marcuse is one of these really important leading philosophers and intellectuals at the time trying to make sense of Nazism. And so the CIA, who's, at this point in time or earlier, trying to in some sense, right, is having a conflict, right, with Germany. They ask Marcuse, this theorist, to try to help them produce some kind of anti-propaganda to match the kind of marketing of the Nazis. So the last thing I kind of want to say about Marcuse is that he became this really hugely popular countercultural figure in the United States after he emigrated to the United States. He became really this kind of figurehead of the student protest movement that you might be familiar with from May 1968 that kind of broke out all across the world. We had kind of students, college students, raising kind of demands, and Marcuse was really seen as this kind of popular figure who was leading the way. So actually, really in the 60s and the 70s in the United States, Marcuse was really, he came to be, as I said, associated with this kind of counterculture movement. So, you have hippies, you have anti-war kind of students, you have people who are just kind of experimenting in different ways of living, different alternative forms of life, so-called counterculture. And that a lot of these kinds of movements identified Marcuse, the author of One-Dimensional Man in particular, as somebody who is going to help them kind of understand how they're going to get their bearings in these new experiments for a living that a lot of people were undertaking, especially in the 60s in the United States. So his 1964 book, One-Dimensional Man, is what I have asked you to read from for this module. And it's I think Marcuse's definitely his most famous of his works. And One-Dimensional Man is published in 1964, and since then, it's really become a classic, a sort of classic in the realm of social theory. And in particular, it's become kind of a classic within the tradition of critical social theory, right? This kind of critical theory associated with the Frankfurt School. So in this book, I've really only asked you guys to read the introduction and the first chapter, but in this book, Marcuse lays out his so-called critical theory of technology. His kind of critical approach to how to think about technology. So what I want to do is really focus on, how he understands this critical approach, this kind of critical theory of technology. And that's what I think, be focusing on for the remainder of my lecture for today. So I want to begin just by taking a look at a passage from the Introduction to One-Dimensional Man, where Marcuse kind of describes his project, right? He kind of gives this overarching view of what he's up to in One-Dimensional Man. And in particular, he is, in this passage, kind of spelling out what he's going to do in One-Dimensional Man in terms of critical theory. So, in other words, he's going to give us a kind of a look at what is really specific to the critical theory approach to technology that he's kind of pioneering here. So let's take a look at this passage, and in this passage we'll get a sense for what is the kind of unique approach to the unique method or philosophical approach that Marcuse brings to technology. So let's take a look at this passage. So he says, the capabilities, intellectual and material, of contemporary society are immeasurably greater than ever before, which means the scope of society's domination over the individual is immeasurably greater than ever before. Our society distinguishes itself by conquering the centrifugal social forces with technology rather than terror, on the dual basis of an overwhelming efficiency and an increasing standard of living. And here's where I think things start getting really important for Marcuse's project. To investigate the roots of these technological developments and examine their historical alternatives is part of the aim of a critical theory of contemporary society. A theory which analyzes society in the light of its used and unused or abused capabilities for improving the human condition. Okay. So again, pretty large quote, and again, Marcuse is a bit more dense, a bit more detailed, a bit more of a technical thinker than someone like Susan Schneider. But let's try to figure out what he's trying to get at here in this passage. So first, he kind of seems to be beginning this passage with a reflection about our society increasingly coming to be organized around technology, right? Our society seems to be mediated, conditioned, organized by technology in important ways these days. Technology has become exceptionally powerful, and now it really reaches nearly every aspect of our lives. And indeed, Marcuse says that technology has even taken the place of terror. And here, by that, I take him to mean that technology, it's now technology primarily, not the fear of violence primarily, or state-sanctioned violence or otherwise. That's basically what keeps us in check. That's what I take into meaning there, right? Once upon a time, what is it that kind of kept people in check in society? Well, it was kind of more of the threat of force and violence from the authorities. Marcuse is, I think, suggesting that, well, these days it's really more technology which plays that role, right? Technology is kind of what keeps us in check. Technology is what binds us together, so to speak, in contemporary technology. So now, given these basic kind of facts of life, so to speak, about the all-important role of technology in our lives, Marcuse outlines what he understands to be the task of a critical theory of technology in what follows in this passage. So he seems to be suggesting that a critical theory of technology is going to focus on the way that technology relates to society, very basically. But more specifically, a critical theory of technology is going to focus on the way that technology relates to the project of human emancipation or to the project of human liberation. So I want to try to unpack a little bit what Marcuse understands by how it is that maybe technology can be related to the project of human emancipation or the project of human flourishing. So Marcuse, he raises a number of kind of questions for us to inquire into in One-Dimensional Man, and here's some of the guiding questions that I think kind of give a little bit of sense for what he has in mind in raising these questions about the relationship between technology and prospects for human flourishing or human freedom. So, as a critical theorist of technology, his basic questions are something like, well, first of all, how did our society come to be organized around technology in the first place? How have technology and power and the mechanisms of social control been historically linked, right? So this is kind of a basic, just kind of historical question that a critical theory of technology is going to try to pose, right? How did society come to be organized this way around technology? Does technology allow us to be free in the fullest sense available for humans? This is kind of one of the really crucial questions from Marcuse that he's asking in his critical theory of technology. We know that technology really is all-pervasive. It's ubiquitous. It's rolled into every aspect of our lives. It really even maybe is what binds together humans in society. But Marcuse wants us to ask, and really ask, well, does technology actually currently allow humans to be free in the fullest sense of the term? So what he means by this is, is technology actually helping us accomplish our basic goals as humans, or does it perhaps hold us back in important ways? Does the kind of contemporary development of technology, where our resources are being put, are they actually really helping us as a human species become more free and more in charge of our destiny? Or is it the case that the way that technology is kind of shaken out, it's actually encouraging us to become less independent, more dependent, and giving up a lot of responsibility? This is one of the kind of crucial questions that Marcuse wants us to be thinking about. And then finally, just a kind of slight tweak on this previous question: how can technology contribute to the project of human emancipation? So specifically, how can we change technology? What kind of interventions would we have to undertake in our society such that technology, instead of contributing to, say, our dependency or to us being involved in false needs, to kind of jump the gun a little bit, how is it specifically that we can use technology more to our collective benefits as a human species? So what kinds of historical alternatives are there, Marcuse wants to ask as a critical theorist? He uses this language of historical alternatives very often. And, really basically what he's asking there is, did the world have to turn out the way that it currently has right now? Or could it have turned out otherwise? Were there different possibilities for how to link technology and society that maybe have been overlooked, hidden, stifled, obscured, made uncompelling, etc.? He also, I think, another kind of way of raising this question about how technology can contribute to the project of human emancipation or human flourishing is to ask the question of what might be a better way of using technology or organizing society that focuses on improving the human condition, right? So given these sorts of questions, this is again the kind of basic questions that Marcuse, as a critical theorist of technology, really wants to ask. It becomes incumbent for us to ask, well, if there really are truly unrealized potential in technology, if there really is these kind of undeveloped or unrealized potentials for utilizing technology for improving the world and indeed improving human life, better forms of technology that are currently in existence, then how would we even go about identifying these more helpful forms of technology? Right? This is the kind of thing, the important question that we're left with again. So Marcuse actually provides some, I think, preliminary answers to these sorts of questions about at least how we're able to try to identify as critical theorists or critical thinkers about technology, about how we're going to identify what might be better ways or worse ways of utilizing technology as a human species. So let's take a look here on page XLI, that's 41, I believe. Okay, so the attempt to answer these questions, Marcuse writes, demands a series of initial abstractions. In order to identify and define the possibilities of an optimal development, the critical theory must abstract from the actual organization and utilization of society's resources, and from the results of this organization and utilization. Such abstraction, which refuses to accept the given universe of facts as the final context of validation, such transcending analysis of the facts in the light of their arrested and denied possibilities, pertains to the very structure of social theory. Skipping down to the next page, Marcuse writes, social theory is concerned with the historical alternatives which haunt the established society as subversive tendencies and forces. And then finally, I want to come back to this point, this part in the passage that I bold-faced and underlined. Marcuse says, the values attached to the alternatives do become facts when they are translated into reality by historical practice. The theoretical concepts terminate with social change. Okay, so here what I want us to think about is what is it that Marcuse seems to mean by abstraction? Right? He's using this term abstraction, quite a bit in the readings for this module. So what does he mean by this, and how does he really see abstraction as allowing us to maybe envision or imagine different possibilities for utilizing technology to improve the human condition? So at first sight, at least, Marcuse, I think, wants to say that to engage in abstraction or abstract thinking is to remove yourself, to kind of isolate yourself, to distance yourself in some sense. Now, what exactly is it that Marcuse is asking us or suggesting to us we have to kind of be able to abstract from, distance ourselves, isolate ourselves from? And I think what he's ultimately arguing is that if we're going to be able to think about how it is that we can use technology differently for improving human life, differently than it's been used, we need to strive to remove ourselves from the whole in which it makes no sense to question each and every part. So this is what I think that Marcuse really has in mind by saying that a critical theory of technology has to kind of utilize abstraction or abstract thinking, right? He wants us to kind of take, to really focus on the part, right, as opposed to the whole in which society and technology really are all kind of united and glommed together. So I think what he's saying, first of all, is if we're going to try to recognize a different way of using technology that's going to be more conducive to the historical project of human freedom, what we have to do is basically try to consider what seems to be unquestionably self-evident and obvious within the current social order. Okay, so that's kind of the first step, at least, of what Marcuse is saying. If we're going to even ask this question, well, first of all, we have to try to step outside of the current universe of discourse. We have to kind of step outside of the current way in which technology and society are glued together. And that's what he thinks abstraction is essentially describing. So in other words, we need to abstract, Marcuse wants to say, pull ourselves back, isolate ourselves from the second nature, so to speak, to which we've grown accustomed in contemporary society, in order to recognize the genuine historical alternatives that may have been stifled or made to seem impossible within contemporary society. So again, very basically, Marcuse wants to say that we're not going to be able to discover or think about new ways for using technology to organize society for the better if we aren't able to take a step back, first of all, and really critically question this whole unity of society and technology that we've grown used to. So there's this bold-faced and underlined little passage here that I want to take a look at for a second, because I think it's actually a pretty crucial part of Marcuse's explanation about how we're going to try to approach technology. So I'm just going to read it again. So he says, the values attached to the alternatives do become facts when they are translated into reality by historical practice. So what is Marcuse trying to say in this very provocative statement? I think what he's saying is that what we take to be simple facts, right? What we take to be just simple, obvious social facts of life always actually emerge out of specific social and historical circumstances, right? So anything we take to be even a simple fact, he wants to point out, it's always emerging from or coming out of a specific time in history, a specific kind of social context. And so what this means for Marcuse and other thinkers is that, well, facts, what we consider to be facts, things that we don't really question, things we take to be just kind of obvious and self-evident, these facts actually reflect the values, right? The things that certain people think are important in the societies from which they emerge. I'll say that again. So Marcuse and others want to insist that facts always reflect the values of the societies out of which they emerge. And this is something that we don't tend to reflect on very much. This is something we don't tend to really think about too much. But for Marcuse and later for Andrew Feenberg, they want to say that this point is actually pretty crucial for trying to think about technology, right, from this critical standpoint. So let me just give you a really quick example of how it is that something we consider to be a fact really emerges only from a very specific set of social values. So Andrew Feenberg, the author we're going to read later on in this class, after Marcuse, he provides this example. So it may be familiar later on. So Feenberg points out that the modern sidewalk, which we don't have too many of in Southwest Florida, but if you're on a sidewalk, the modern sidewalk, you'll notice that near an intersection, there's always a little lip. There's a curb right to the sidewalk. This is actually something that's quite recent in development. For a while, sidewalks were in existence without any little lip or curb. But then, what happened is decades of advocates trying to bring to light the fact that people who are disabled, people who don't have the same ability, people who are using, let's say, a wheelchair or something, they're not actually able to really access the sidewalks in the same way that other people are. And so they advocated, these advocates, they really tried to push for changing the design of sidewalks. And now, guess what? We don't even remember that this is the case. We don't even remember that it was actually this specific kind of interest in making sidewalks accessible for everybody, not just people who have, let's say, typical abilities, right? These values, they become ingrained or really kind of crystallize into this technology, right? We take it just as kind of a simple fact of life today that a sidewalk just has this kind of lip. It has this curb for wheelchairs or for accessibility. But Marcuse would insist that, well, even though we take this to be a simple fact, this fact has to be understood in terms of, well, what were the values? What were the things that people thought were important that made this possible? So this is just a little example of the way in which Marcuse and others want to think about the way that the things we take to be facts always emerge from certain kinds of values, a certain set of interests, desires, or things that we think are just the most important. So how does this all relate back to abstraction for Marcuse, this whole business of facts and values and sidewalks? Well, I think Marcuse is saying that if we don't abstract these facts about technology, these facts about our society, if we don't abstract these from the conditions of their emergence, then we won't really be able to recognize the values that go into them and condition them. Okay, so that's why I think that Marcuse is suggesting we have to try to engage in this act of abstraction as critical theorists of technology, right? The idea, I think, again, is we've kind of grown accustomed to just kind of accepting certain things as facts and not really asking questions about them. Marcuse, though, is insisting that if we do this, if we just take all the technology around us as something that just kind of, has always been there, something that doesn't reflect any interests or desires or biases, then we're not really going to be able to understand, well, how is it that we might be able to, let's say, design more different technology that reinforces different values, right? They say values that are more universal than the values that are currently ingrained in the technical devices and tools that we surround ourselves with. When values, right, things that people find important, right, good or bad, good or evil, right or wrong, these sorts of things are values. People tend to think of it as values. When values become reinforced by facts, or when they become supported by a realm of things which we take to be just mere facts, it becomes really, really difficult to raise any kinds of questions about them, right? When values just become supported by all the technology and all of the world around us, these values become very, very hard to see and very, very hard to kind of ask questions about. It becomes really hard for us to ask questions about whether the values that are currently being reinforced by our technical world, by the technology we use, are really good ones. Are these the values that we as a human civilization want to affirm? right? Are these the values that we think are actually important, the ones that are being reinforced by our technology? Or are there other values that, again, we think are more important to crystallize within the technology in our world today? So suffice to say that for Marcuse, we need to be able to abstract these facts of life regarding technology in the social world if we're going to be able to identify the historical alternatives to the role that technology currently plays in society. So if we want to be able to think about the possibilities that technology could hold for improving human life, right, we need to be able to abstract, Marcuse says, from the current universe of facts. We need to think about how these facts have become facts, right? How these things have become so unquestionably self-evident and obvious that we don't even ask questions about them anymore. But Marcuse thinks that this requires what he calls abstraction. Okay, so another kind of crucial theme from the beginning of Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man has to do with this question about whether technology is something that's neutral, right? We tend to think that technology is politically neutral, it's socially neutral, it's ethically neutral. We tend to think that technology is just mere, cold, dead, scientific, lifeless facts, right? Not having anything to do with the kind of struggles, social, political, moral, etc., that are part of our lives. However, Marcuse wants to challenge this idea, right? And this probably should have been somewhat obvious from the previous point about abstraction, right? The technology of our world, Marcuse wants to argue, it's not neutral, it's not value neutral, but actually it comes and recommends certain values as the things that we should believe in, the things that we should take seriously. And for Marcuse, it also encourages us to think that, well, other values are not so important. So Marcuse wants us to think about this. So let's take a look at this passage. So in the face of the totalitarian features of this society, the traditional notion of the neutrality of technology can no longer be maintained. Technology as such cannot be isolated from the use to which it is put. The technological society as a system of domination which operates already in the concept and construction of techniques. The way in which the society organizes the life of its members involves an initial choice between historical alternatives, which are determined by the inherited level of the material and intellectual culture. The choice itself results from the play of the dominant interests. It anticipates specific modes of transforming and utilizing man and nature and rejects other modes. It is one project of realization among others. But once the project has become operative in the basic institutions and relations, it tends to become exclusive and to determine the development of the society as a whole. As a technological universe, advanced industrial society is a political universe, the latest stage in the realization of a specific historical project, namely the experience, transformation, and organization of nature as the mere stuff of domination. Okay, so a lot of exciting prose here. But what is Marcuse suggesting here? Or why, rather, is he suggesting that we must question this idea that technology is neutral? Well, I think that to begin with, Marcuse wants to stress that, well, technology can't be neutral. We can't see it as value neutral if it mediates and organizes every bit of our lives, right? We can't think about it as neutral if technology is just kind of wrapped up in everything we do as humans, including, presumably, those things that have to do with what we think is important or right or wrong. Secondly, I think Marcuse would say that, well, technology can't be seen as neutral because, again, it actually crystallizes our values in concrete form, right? So that sidewalk that I was just speaking about a minute ago, it's not politically neutral, but it actually renders, it makes into concrete, actual concrete, the values that we as a society have decided are important ones, namely, for instance, universal accessibility. So that's the sense in which I think that's really important sense in which Marcuse wants to say technology is not actually neutral, right? It actually it crystallizes our values. It recommends certain values and dismisses others, right? And finally, I think Marcuse wants to point out that technology can't be really seen as neutral because it always involves a choice between alternatives, right? It always involves a choice between this and that. And well, if we're going to be choosing, right, technology always involves some kind of choice. Well, what is it that's really going to lead us to make these different kinds of choices, these kinds of choices between historical alternatives apart from values? Finally, the last kind of point that Marcuse, I think, wants to raise for about why we should reject the idea that technology is neutral, and this comes out from the very final sentence from this passage. I think he wants to say we can't see technology as neutral because, very basically, if we take a look at the technology around us in the world, we'll see that this technology, it fundamentally reflects the value, the importance, the concern, the fear, the bias, the prejudice of complete mastery, right? So, in other words, right, in this last sentence, Marcuse says, as a technological universe, advanced industrial society is a political universe, the latest stage in the realization of a specific historical project, namely the experience, transformation, and organization of nature as the mere stuff of domination. Marcuse is saying, basically, technology is all about mastery, dominance, and control. Specifically, technology has been all about humans being able to control, master, and dominate the natural world. Well, though this has become very, very basic to just like how we understand human civilization and how we even understand technology, Marcuse wants to point out, well, this is a very, very specific set of values, right, which have come to prevail within contemporary technology, right? Technology is not just something neutral, but it's primarily about how it is that humans are able to achieve some kind of sense of mastery, domination, or control, okay? All right. So now I want to turn to chapter 1 of Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and take a look at a couple passages here where, again, he kind of is unpacking some really important, crucial concepts from his critical theory of technology. So I want to really just focus right now on this discussion that Marcuse offers of false needs, or really about this distinction between true and false needs, as this is really, really central to what he's about. So first of all, Marcuse writes on page 6 that the most effective and the most enduring form of warfare against liberation or against human freedom is the implanting of material and intellectual needs that perpetuate obsolete forms of the struggle for existence. By this, I think he means that the possibility of employing technology to make life more livable is really continually stifled by what he identifies as the creation of false needs, right? So he's saying, what's the biggest obstacle to humans as a civilization to really achieve true flourishing or true kind of freedom for all of its members? And Marcuse wants to say, in answer to that question, right, what is it that does this? Well, how is it that people are made, or how is it that society is made to be less free, right, and not be able to use technology to improve our lives? He says it's through this constant creation of what he calls false needs. But what makes a need false exactly, right? This is a pretty difficult and complex question, right? He's saying, essentially, again, we want to be using technology to make our lives better. We want to use technology to really pursue what are true human needs. But Marcuse is saying, unfortunately, the way that technology has become to operate in our lives, it doesn't actually make us, doesn't really support true needs as humans, but it gets us kind of caught up in what he calls false needs, or things that really are unimportant, or maybe even distort what are important for humans in general. So in order to kind of understand, right, how it is that technology has limited our societal possibilities for freedom, we need to kind of ask the question, well, what is it for Marcuse that makes a false need false? How are we able to distinguish true needs from false needs, right? For instance, if I experience a need as something, as indeed a need, then in what sense can it be false, right? These are the kinds of questions I want to think about here. So let's read this passage. So on page 7, Marcuse says, we may distinguish both true and false needs. False are those which are superimposed upon the individual by particular social interests in his repression. The needs which perpetuate toil, aggressiveness, misery, and injustice. Their satisfaction might be most gratifying to the individual, but this happiness is not a condition which has to be maintained and protected if it serves to arrest the development of the ability, his own and others, to recognize the disease of the whole and grasp the chances of curing the disease. The result, then, is euphoria in unhappiness. Most of the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and consume in accordance with the advertisements, to love and hate what others love and hate, belong to this category of false needs. Now, skipping down a little bit, no matter how much such needs may have become the individual's own, reproduced and fortified by the conditions of his existence, no matter how much he identifies himself with them and finds himself in their satisfaction, they continue to be what they were from the beginning, products of a society whose dominant interest demands repression. Okay, so again, a rather long and detailed and complex quote, which is unfortunately what we get from Marcuse. Thing is, Marcuse has some pretty exciting and I think important things to say, so we got to try to tease out what he's getting at here. So again, the basic distinction is, in what sense are false needs false for Marcuse, right? If we experience them as true needs, something that we absolutely have to have and must have, then how can they be false, right? This is the kind of question that I think that we need to be able to ask ourselves if we're really following Marcuse and where he's going in his critical theory of technology. So I want to think about how a false need could be false for Marcuse, and also, well, how does he really think about true needs? So first of all, we might say that a false need is false in that it is historically contingent. So we might say that in something we experience as a need, something we absolutely have to have, it might actually, on Marcuse's discussion, at least be a false need if it has emerged within a particular historical community and reflects only the desires and only the preferences of those communities. So again, something I might experience as a real need, Marcuse is saying, well, it might actually be a false need if it's something that has really only become desirable and important for a particular historical community, a particular group of people, and doesn't really, and reflects only the desires and only the interests and wants of that particular group of people. But if I have come to identify these particular interests and desires and preferences of this particular group of people as just desirable in general, as just needs, as needs that everyone needs to satisfy, but again, if they only really only make sense for a particular group of people, Marcuse might say, well, we should think about these as false needs. Maybe they're not true needs, right? And I say if they're historically contingent. That's to say if they belong to some sort of particular time and place and don't go beyond that. So we might also say that false needs are false insofar as they are coercive, right? Or insofar as they coerce us into experiencing certain things as needs. So similarly, we might say that something that I experience as a need is nevertheless false if it imposes values and interests and desires onto me that are not really mine, right? So that's what it means to say that a need is false if it's coercive. A need is coercive if it really imposes some value or interest onto me that doesn't really come from me. So in other words, a false need might be false in the sense that it's not something that I truly desire, but something that maybe someone who looks like me or who has similar life history to me would desire. So we might also say that, and I think this is the more crucial parts about the way in which false needs are false for Marcuse. We might say that needs are false if they're alienating. So in other words, if something I experience as a need or an intense desire actually makes me feel dependent or disempowered So, for instance, you could think about addiction. So I experience, let's say, when I wake up in the morning, I have to look at my cell phone and see, what have I missed from last night that I fell asleep to. I experience this as an intense need. But like, let's say, I don't know, some sort of craving or some sort of addiction, this kind of desire this need to look at my phone when I wake up in the morning, it doesn't make me feel more on top of things. It doesn't make me feel more independent and more powerful, but it actually makes me feel more dependent on my phone. It makes me feel less powerful and less in control of myself by myself, right? So in this sense, Marcuse might say that needs which become like addictive, right, or which have the character of an addiction, right, are false because they disempower us. They encourage us to become dependent individuals, right? And then finally, and this is the most important sense to my mind of how it is that Marcuse understands false needs as false, he wants to say that false needs are false if they thwart the actualization of our human essence, right? A false need is false if it stifles or thwarts or proves to be an obstacle for our ability as humans to actualize our potential or to actualize what it is that makes us, for Marcuse and others, distinctively human. So for Marcuse, as for really many other philosophers before him in the Western philosophical tradition, what it is that makes us distinctively human, right? What it is that sets us over and against all other objects, non-human animals, etc., is our ability to rationally and self-consciously transform the outer world. Okay, I'll say that again. This is what it means to be a human. For if you go back to Aristotle, if you go back to Hegel, if you go back to Marcuse, if you go back to a whole host of thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, they'll say, well, what is it that really makes a human what they are and sets them apart from all other kinds of animals? Well, it's the fact that humans are able to think using reason, or using logic, using language, and we're able to self-consciously transform the world that we live in on the basis of our rational, self-conscious thoughts. This is, for Marcuse and many others, this is what defines humans, our ability to transform the world according to our own rational understanding of it. So, to put it another way, this kind of what's important to be human, or what makes a human on this tradition, is the ability to recognize the world right around me as one that I have the power to change. Right? There's not any history of cats, right? At least no history that belongs to cats. We might, as humans, write a history of cats, but cats themselves, they don't have any culture. They don't have any history that they relate to. They don't really have a project as a species. Marcuse and others are going to say, well, humans are different. Humans are actually able to set to work on the world and transform the world according to what makes the most sense to us as rational, logical beings that communicate. And so Marcuse and a lot of thinkers, they want to say this is really most important to what we are as humans. We're the kinds of beings that are able to recognize the world as something that I have some kind of active control over. Or to kind of quote Hegel here, from whom Marcuse is drawing, to be human is to be able to recognize myself in what is other, right? To recognize oneself in what is other. That's the kind of essence of humanity, or really that's the essence of what makes humans free for these thinkers in this tradition that Marcuse is coming from. So all this is to say that Marcuse is going to say a need is false if it's dehumanizing, if pursuing some sort of need actually makes us lose touch with what makes us distinctively human, which is to be able to rationally and self-consciously transform the world. Well, then again, Marcuse is going to say this is not a true need, but it's a false need. It's one that's actually preventing us from actualizing what is our essence as humans. That is, to be free, to actively transform the world and to work upon it on the basis of our rational ideas. Okay, so what about true needs? Right, so we've talked about false needs a bit, and Marcuse is, of course, very insistent that we have to kind of be on the lookout for false needs. We have to kind of try to reject these because this is going to prevent us from really actualizing our distinctive potential as humans. So what's a true need? How does he envision true needs? Well, I think that first of all, it's important to recognize that Marcuse says that the only kind of unqualified true needs are the ones that he calls vital needs, which he says we can say nourishment, clothing, and lodging, right? These are the only truly vital needs. However, I think it's important that Marcuse, I don't believe that he's saying that the only true needs that we have as humans are reducible to those that are necessary just for survival, right? So he's not. I think he's not just saying he's saying that we do need to we need nourishment, we need clothing, we need lodging, but I don't think he wants to say that anything beyond this counts as a false need. I think he wants to say that there's something between surviving and flourishing that's important and it's at stake here. So similarly, I think he wants to say, well, true needs, we might understand a true need is true if it's conducive to the project of human emancipation, right? Or if it's conducive to humans actualizing their essence, which again is to rationally and self-consciously transform the world together. So again, here we might say that, a true need is not true for Marcuse only if it alleviates some kind of material scarcity or if it frees up our time. This is not a true need if it just kind of satisfies some material scarcity or gives us more free time. But I think he wants to say a true need is only true if they're conducive to the human project, the historical project of human emancipation or human flourishing. We lose sight of this historical project of human emancipation or human flourishing, Marcuse, I think, suggests, because we focus on the satisfaction of just what are fleeting and ultimately repressive desires, right? These desires are wants that are bound to historically contingent and thus changeable social arrangements. So I want to say a few things about false needs, about examples of false needs, about how Marcuse is inviting us to think about examples before moving on. So characteristically, Marcuse says that we should think about these needs to relax, to fit in, to blend in with those around you, to love and hate what others love and hate, and even to have fun as false needs. And this is, to me on my first read, this is laughable. Marcuse, really? You're saying that fun is a false need? Come on, man. But I think that what he's really asking us to recognize, or what he's inviting us to think about is, well, in the contemporary world, let's say in 2021, why do we experience fun so much as a need, as something that we absolutely must have, right? And I think that Marcuse would encourage us to ask, well, does the need to have fun and to relax, does it become only especially forceful and necessary in a world where we're encouraged to be extremely busy and extremely productive all the time? Well, if so, well, it sounds like maybe we don't need to be seeking out as much fun and relaxation as we are, but maybe fun and relaxation is only something that currently feels so necessary and so important on account of the way that we have contingently organized society. So I think this is kind of what Marcuse would ask us to think about and think about false needs. Marcuse is not saying don't have fun and be always self-critical and worried whenever you're having a fun time. But I think he's asking, well, when we feel the desire to have fun or relax so intensely, well, we should really think about what is causing that. And so I think Marcuse would say that things like hardcore drugs, extreme sports, and even like at your fingertips entertainment really only emerge as the satisfaction of a need in a society that is hyper-focused on competition and productivity, right? So again, I think that Marcuse is not saying, don't seek out fun, don't seek out relaxation. He's saying, try to inquire into why it is that it seems that we need so much fun and so much relaxation these days. Does it have something to do with the way that we have organized our society? And if so, maybe we should reorganize our society in a way that doesn't require us to need so much downtime and so much time to unwind and to relax. So I think that Marcuse, when he's talking about false needs as having fun, relaxing, etc., I think really what he's not trying to suggest, again, don't have any fun, don't relax, but again, and I think this is one of the reasons why he was so popular with the students, the student protest movement in the 1960s, is because he pointed out, well, everyone's telling you students, oh, just what are you guys so worried about? You're students. Students don't have to worry about things. Students should just be having fun. Shut up and dribble the basketball, so to speak, right? And I think the students noticed, reading Marcuse, that, well, wait a minute. Sometimes when we experience fun, relaxation as what's expected of us, that's, it's sometimes kind of insulting, and sometimes it's a way of kind of controlling us or making us seem like children, right? So Marcuse is, again, not concerned that, oh, don't have fun, don't relax, but he's saying that a society that requires so much fun and relaxation among its individuals is maybe one that's actually repressive, that's actually carving out certain determinate roles. You students, you shouldn't be caring about politics. You shouldn't be caring about the world. You should be only just having fun, doing unserious, trivial stuff, right? Marcuse, I think, recognized that there's a way in which you can encourage somebody to have fun if you don't think that anything they're doing is important, or that they have any ability to do anything important. So again, this is not to say, I think Marcuse is not saying don't have fun, don't relax, but he's saying think about what is being accomplished when you are experiencing this need to relax, to have fun, to chill out, and to blend in as so utterly important. And how does that fit in with the way that we organize our society in general? Okay. All right. And so finally, I want to end by just taking a little bit look at Marcuse's concept of one-dimensionality, right? His book, One-Dimensional Man, obviously puts to work this concept of one-dimensionality quite a bit. So I want to take a look by way of conclusion here at a little passage from page 14 from The New Forms of Control in One-Dimensional Man, and try to get a sense for what is it that Marcuse means by one-dimensionality. Okay, so he writes, the productive apparatus and the goods and services which it produces sell or impose the social system as a whole. The means of mass transportation and communication, the commodities of lodging, food, and clothing, the irresistible output of the entertainment and information industry carry with them prescribed attitudes and habits, certain intellectual and emotional reactions, which bind the consumers more or less pleasantly to the producers, and through the latter to the whole. The products indoctrinate and manipulate. They promote a false consciousness which is immune against its falsehood. And as these beneficial products become available to more individuals and more social classes, the indoctrination they carry ceases to be publicity. It becomes a way of life. Skipping down, thus emerges a pattern of one-dimensional thought and behavior, in which ideas, aspirations, and objectives that, by their content, transcend the established universe of discourse and action are either repelled or reduced to terms of this universe. Okay, so once again, a pretty detailed and complex passage to work with. So what does Marcuse seem to mean by one-dimensionality, one-dimensional thought and behavior, or a one-dimensional man? Well, from this passage and others, Marcuse is suggesting that one-dimensionality, it really describes the way that increasingly our society incorporates all alternatives, all choices, and even all forms of resistance to the status quo, so that in the end, we are not able to even imagine a different form of society, but are rather locked into one historical course. Again, not being able to recognize other historical alternatives for how we collectively want to organize our lives. So one-dimensionality, again, refers to, from Marcuse, the way that we're given so many choices, so many decisions these days, so many preferences, right? And all of these different alternative ways for how to live our lives. And indeed, if you go to Starbucks, I currently looked this up, Starbucks has 87,000 different drink combinations at present, right? So we're given all these different decisions and choices, but Marcuse's concern is, do all these choices and all these decisions and alternatives, do they really present us with any genuine alternatives, right? Do all of the choices, all of the infinite abilities for you to personalize and customize your cell phone or your drink at Starbucks, do they really offer us any genuine alternatives and different ways of thinking and living? Marcuse, he's really concerned about how it is that, again, increasingly, instead of having different ways of thinking, different ways of acting, different ways of organizing our society, different ways of thinking about ourselves, more and more and more, we are, in some sense, reducing our multidimensional, complex world to just one dimension, right? Which is to say, smoothing out and flattening out all contrast, any difference. And our society, Marcuse wants to say, is, again, just kind of retracting into one small, thin dimension. So, again, if we're choosing between Android and Apple, Verizon and T-Mobile, Ford and Mazda, meaningless work and mindless fun, Marcuse wants to ask us, do these choices actually mean anything? Do these decisions actually empower us? Do they actually lead us to a more free life, right? Or is it the case that we're just kind of really going through the motions and indeed locking ourselves more and more into one single historical trajectory? Are we really contributing to the way and direction that our society is developing? This is the basic concern of Marcuse's. Are we as individuals actually able to contribute to the way and direction our society is developing? Since that's again what it seems for Marcuse to mean for us to be free. Or are we just kind of, again, going through the motions and choosing the most comfortable and convenient options within a life where there really are no true alternatives? The latter is what Marcuse calls one-dimensional society. Again, this form of society, this world where there aren't really any genuine alternatives, but really just endlessly more and more and more of the same. And Marcuse was so concerned about this one-dimensional society because, as somebody who very well knew the horrors of National Socialism, he was very concerned that, well, totalitarianism, this kind of system of government which insists there's really only one way to do things and all other differences are forbidden, right? He noticed that, well, something similar seems to be happening outside of Nazi Germany within Western consumer society. And so, again, his concern with one-dimensionality is perhaps unwittingly, for Marcuse already in 1964, but maybe more obviously today, are we locking ourselves unwittingly into a totalitarian form of society by virtue of the way that we are using technology, right? And if so, is there any means for changing this? Is there any means for resistance, or is it already too late? In 1964, Marcuse was already concerned about this possibility, but today, philosophers, social scientists, and theorists, they're actually returning to Marcuse once again because it seems that a lot of the ideas and questions he was raising at that period are becoming even more relevant. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time. All right.